had some old-fashioned ways. In the old-fashioned meetings as they tarried there, in the old-fashioned manner, how God answered their prayer. 'Twas an old-fashioned meeting in an old-fashioned place, where some old-fashioned people had some old-fashioned ways.
In 1949, the Reverend Duncan Campbell, a Faith Mission evangelist, was invited to conduct a 2-week mission in Barvas Church on the Isle of Lewis. He stayed for over 2 years. The reason? Revival. Here, in the words of the people who lived through those remarkable days, is the wonderful story of that momentous event.
I think it was Thomas Chalmers who defined revival as the impact of the personality of Christ upon a community. Now, we've seen the impact of Christ and his personality upon the individual in hundreds of thousands and millions of cases. We've seen that same impact upon a congregation at a specific time. You go into a congregation for a meeting and you say, my goodness, that was powerful, God was there, things are happening. But to have actually seen that upon a community, upon the converted and the unconverted, where the whole atmosphere changed, where there was a tangible knowledge of being in the presence of God, where not just one or two, but many people totally rebellious against God, unknowingly so, being stopped by a power they couldn't do anything about.
I arrived at Stornoway on the Isle of Lewis by boat and was met by the minister and one of his office bearers. Just as I stepped ashore, the office bearer said to me, "Mr. Campbell, might I ask you a question? Are you walking with God?" I was happy to be able to reply, "Well, I can say this at any rate, that I fear God."
He impressed me as a man who, like Enoch, walked with God and was within the Lord's will, and it was so easy for God to use him as a channel of blessing to others, because his own walk was close to God.
Well, the very first time I ever saw Duncan Campbell, as far as I can remember, was in the pulpit. And he was tall, very pleasant looking, very forceful.
He was very ordinary in many ways, apart from his ministry, which was extraordinary.
Well, he was a very gracious man. That's one thing I'll always remember, very gracious. He was a tremendous preacher, a very powerful preacher, a man really full of fire.
I remember once at Barvas, when the ministers got into their car and left to go to their manses, wherever, he saw a lorry full of young people, and he went along to them, threw his briefcase into the lorry and joined them in the lorry. That impressed me strangely, very, very deeply, because I thought, well, here's a man among men. He's identified with the people, and he's just one of us in a sense, although his ministry put him on a higher plane.
Now, over the years, we've had him coming to our own home here when we preached at services. And he was a very easy man to have staying with you. You know, you didn't have to make a fuss of him. You did, but you didn't have to.
Not many people like him today. I'll always remember the occasion when he hammered the pulpit with his fist and he broke a bone in his wrist. We have very few people like that today, and quite dramatic in some ways as well. But obviously he was a man who was used of God tremendously and open to God in many ways. And God blessed him, and God blessed his ministry when he was in Lewes in particular.
He was a good man, out and out for the one thing, that souls would be born again.
Oh, that thou wouldst rend the heavens, that thou wouldst come down, that the mountains might flow down at thy presence. I never read those words without my mind going back to what actually happened in the parish of Barvas, when God in his mercy visited the people in reviving power.
The revival had started before he came. The revival started with the people of God in the first place. They were hungry for God to come, and they were praying for God to come. And they were led to ask him to come to Lewes. I don't think he had ever been in Lewes before. That was a wonderful thing, that God should bring a person to the island who was not from the island, but who could speak our language, which was very much more the language of the islands then than it is now. I think that he was a prepared man coming to the island. The interesting thing is that some people who had never met him before recognized him as the man whom God had sent. I think of one from our congregation, a retired teacher, and she dreamt beforehand of Duncan Campbell, whom she had never met. And when she sat in the pew in Barvas and looked in the pulpit, she said, "This is the man that I saw."
He went into a situation where the forms of worship and the way of doing things was the same as it had been for an awful long time. There were no faith mission hymns or redemption hymns sung in church. There were the Gaelic psalms. He would have been far more at home in English than he was in Gaelic. There must have been, coming into that situation, questions that other folk would have said, well, if we can change the forum, if we can import something of the kind of culture we have in our situation, then the poor Lewes folk will be the better of it. He never did. He came to the people and became one of them. And you wouldn't have known after a few weeks that he hadn't ministered and lived there all his life. He identified with the spirituality of those who had known revival previously.
As far back as I could remember, the word revival was a very familiar word in our household. My mother and father were constantly praying and longing to see a revival. They had lived through several before and were longing to see the next one. And the words that came from the lips of my mother constantly were, "Oh, for the floods on a thirsty land, oh, for a mighty revival, oh, for a sanctified, fearless band, ready to hail its arrival."
There always has been an element of spirituality in the island. In any case, over the years they've had movements of God's Spirit from time to time, 1939 and occasionally since then. And certainly people knew exactly what would happen if revival came. And no doubt many people would be of the opinion that many of their entertainments and all the rest of it would have to go by the board if God really moved in revival. And certainly when the revival did begin, it was very obvious that people in some ways were afraid of what might happen to their entertainment and to all the rest of it and their way of life, because they knew there would be a change if God did touch their lives.
The spiritual temperature in the island before the revival was religious. but certainly not lively. There was a religious atmosphere, and we had a religious education in the school. We had to learn of the Shorter Catechism and that. And there was family worship in the homes, and everybody knew that. They had promised to bring up their children in the nurture and fear and admonition of the Lord. But it was a spiritual winter before the revival.
When I was growing up, of course I went to the Sunday school, and I was hearing about the Lord all my life. In those days, people used to go to communions here, you know. My mother and father used to go to the communions at different parts of the island. And when they would come on a Monday night, all the friends around the houses here used to come in here to hear about the communions. And we are small boys who are listening to all that, and that's all we were hearing all our lives. We went to Sunday school, and we went to church occasionally, but I wasn't thinking about eternity and anything myself.
When I was converted, I was very much alone, and the elderly Christians used to visit the house quite a lot, and this godly man, the father of one of our present-day deacons, used to tell me that there was a big revival coming and that I would soon have plenty of friends. And I didn't know what to make of this. I just didn't know what to make of it. But these godly people used to come, and we used to sing a lot. And however, the following year, the revival did come. Duncan Campbell came, and the revival did come, as Donald Saunders had said it would.
We used to have throughout the island what was known as little communions, ordained Becca we called it, which was evangelistic service, and turnabout in each congregation. You'd have a week of services, a service every night. So he decided he'd send for Reverend Duncan Campbell. And we'd heard he'd been in Skye and there had been a revival. So he encouraged everyone in the congregation to pray.
There were two sisters. One of them was blind. She was in bed. And the other, they were really two praying warriors. And this day they sent for Mr. Mackay. And they told him to send for Duncan Campbell. I don't know how they got to know about Duncan Campbell, but they told Mr. Mackay to send for Duncan Campbell. And Mr. Mackay sent for Duncan Campbell, and Duncan Campbell couldn't come.
And that was when we were accepting it or not accepting it. And that's when the old lady said, oh yes, we think he will come. Oh, we'll keep praying, he'll come.
So they told Mr. Mackay, you send for Mr. Campbell again, Mr. Campbell is coming. And he sent word to Mr. Campbell again, and Mr. Campbell had to leave, I think it was Bangor. He had to come straight to Barvas. And the people were waiting for him there the night he came.
The great meeting of that period was on the Sunday night in the parish church at Barvas. The church was crowded, and there were as many more outside who couldn't get in. The Spirit of God was moving in such a way that I couldn't preach. I just stood still and gazed upon the wondrous movings of God as men and women all over the church cried for mercy.
The breakthrough was in the Shadder Church, and 5 of them came through. Then the meeting on the Monday night again in the Barvas Church. And for me that was just a downpouring of the Spirit, like the Lord dealing with me and with one of my close friends who had been following the Lord for a few months. It was just another wonderful, wonderful occasion. And from then on there were friends and older people and younger people, and the church was full every night.
Every night when my mother and father would come home, I would ask them, was there any converted tonight? Yes, they would tell me, some of your friends out here, some old people, middle-aged people, somebody from Ness, somebody from Carloway, and so on. And I was rejoicing. I can't understand that to this very day. Why I was rejoicing and I wasn't even converted.
My earliest memories of the revival was the first week the Reverend Duncan Campbell came to the parish of Barvas. He had been preaching there several evenings in the parish church. My parents, who were both Christians, attended the services each evening, and when they came home, they were telling the members of the family about this wonderful preacher they had listened to in the parish church, wanting us to go and listen to him. None of the family went on the weekdays, but on Sunday evening he was preaching in the church at Shader. I went to that service. At the end of the sermon, he announced that he would have a kitchen meeting in the local post office house and inviting any who wanted to go to this meeting. I went home from church with no intention to go to that meeting. But a high school pupil who was next door to me came into the house and asked me if I would accompany her to the kitchen meeting. I hummed and hawed. I wasn't sure what to do. But she said, "I have no one to go with me. Will you not go with me?" In the end, I agreed to go. It was December. I had already made arrangements for the Christmas parties we were going to have in the village. I was going to supply the accordion music, and all the other friends were to be there. And the thought came into my mind, well, surely you're not going to let down your friends after promising to be at the Christmas party and play the accordion. Don't think about accepting Christ as Saviour. Postpone it. After all, you're still a young person. Time enough for religion and Christianity. Perhaps in your declining years, when you've had your taste of earthly pleasures, but not yet. And this battle was raging within my soul. And then the thought came to me, well, if you wait for your Christmas party, what if for you there be no Christmas? What if the Lord should suddenly call you away? Where would you spend eternity if you died unprepared for eternity? And that was the deciding factor. There and then I said to myself, take the world, but give me Jesus. All its joys are but a name, but his love abideth ever, through eternal years the same. When I made my decision, even at that very moment, I felt a great peace flooding into my soul. I felt a great change in my life. I saw everything in a different light. God's people seemed different. The Bible, the preacher, everything around me seemed different. And the girl who had taken me, she was there with several of her colleagues. When I looked, they were weeping under deep conviction of sin. They also made their decision at that moment. That was the beginning of the Lewis revival. We were the first converts. I was the first man to be converted in that revival.
In revival, God moves in the district, and suddenly the whole community becomes God-conscious. An awareness of God and a fear of God grips men and women in such a way that now and again even necessary work has to be given up as people give themselves to waiting upon God.
I was in Glasgow at the time of the revival in Lewis, and I wasn't at all impressed by the things that were happening, by the people who were coming to the Lord, and I didn't certainly want to become involved in it in any way. But a phone call changed that. I received a phone call from Lewis to say my parents were ill and would I come home immediately. I had no intention of going home. So I came home, and when I got home, my parents weren't that sick, and I was a bit angry because they had brought me home. Now, they weren't professing Christians at all at the time. Both of them were later saved in the revival. But then they wanted me to go to the meetings, but I didn't want to go. But one night, I lost all my arguments, and I found myself in the meeting, listening to Duncan Campbell. It was a moving experience, not that I was greatly touched, excepting that I was impressed by the solemnity, by the sincerity of the preacher, and by the fact that so many people were being overcome, if you may put it that way, by the message that was preached, and tears were frequent. But there was no noise or confusion or upset of any kind. It was just that it was a time of revival and God was speaking to the people and they were aware of it. And the awareness of the presence of God, that was the thing. When you came out of the church, it seemed as if the people carried with them that awareness. And with that awareness came the fear of God on the unconverted people. You know, there's a text that says, the sinners in Zion are afraid, fearfulness encompasseth the hypocrites. And people were afraid because this was a supernatural happening. This was God coming into the community. And who can define the presence of God? The presence of God brings solemnity, brings silence, if you like, and certainly an awareness of the supernatural which one could not understand.
People flocked from all over Lewis in the buses to the parish church of Barvas. The aisles were full of people. The pulpit steps, people were sitting there. The church could hold, I would imagine, about 500, not a vacant pew. Mr. Campbell started to preach. That night again, kitchen meeting. Converts in the church meeting, converts in the kitchen meeting that followed. People didn't want to go home.
Islanders aren't given to committing themselves openly or making a fuss about things. But we have to remember ours was a community that was, our older people anyway, they were used to revival. They'd had revival in 1939 and a whole lot of the middle-aged people had been converted in that revival, which probably had more emotional manifestations than the 49 one had. Then the older ones still, who had been members longer, they'd been converted in revivals further back. So that people were used to coming out, identifying with the Lord, but not in an emotional way, making a fuss about it. So they weren't likely to be people who'd be taken in by anything that was just on the surface. So that they had they knew this was a deep work of the Spirit.
After I had been to the first meeting, I couldn't stay away from the next one and the next one. I was just being drawn against my will in a sense, but I couldn't stay away. There was just something. I wanted to be with, I suppose, the others from the village who had started to go to the meetings. So I just tagged along. And I was impressed, but I didn't want anybody to know that I was impressed. In fact, the first night when I came home, my father said to me, "Well, Mary, how did you enjoy that?" And I retorted, "I didn't enjoy it at all." But in actual fact, I was impressed, but I didn't want anybody to know. Typical teenage.
Mr. Campbell used to come down here to this house, and he was preaching in the old house over here. And that house was full. And there was a vestibule right up through the house. And Mr. Campbell would start at one end preaching, and he would walk right up to the other end, then come back again and go up again.
The house was crowded. I wanted a space where I wouldn't be seen by the minister, because I still believed that Jesus was a killjoy. I was there because it was my aunt's house. And you know the Crofters' houses, there are 2 rooms, there's a scullery, there's a lobby from the 2 main rooms, a door, and you go up the stair, and there's usually a bedroom under the stair and 2 or 3 bedrooms upstairs. So I went in this door in the lobby, sat aside so that Duncan Campbell wouldn't see me. Well, it happened that when Duncan came into the house, he sat down by the fire. When he was ready to preach, he got up, he passed up to the room to view the situation, and he saw me sitting in this chair, in this closet. And he says, "You sit where I was sitting." Oh, surely not. Surely I'm not going to be converted tonight. The room emptied. I saw 1 or 2 standing up. And then in a second, it came home to me, "Kenny, you have to tonight. If not tonight, it may not be ever." So I stood up and I said, "Lord, if you will take my life, I give you my life now." And the second I stood up, my life changed. So I went up to that room, a new man in Christ.